Sarah hummed softly as she folded laundry in the cozy, sunlit living room of their new house. Light spilled through the freshly cleaned windows, casting a golden glow on the walls. And for a moment, Sarah allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, savoring the feeling of fresh starts and new beginnings. The past few months had been a whirlwind, filled with packing, moving, and settling into a new town. But at last, she felt a hint of calm. It wasn't much, this house, but it was theirs. It represented a new chapter, one she was determined to make the best of for her family. The sudden crash of the front door bursting open startled her from her thoughts. Sarah looked up just in time to see her son, Alex, charging in, his backpack bouncing wildly on his shoulders as he dashed toward her, eyes wide and brimming with excitement. "Mom, Mom," he shouted, almost breathless. "You won't believe what happened at school today." Sarah set the shirt she was folding down and turned to face her son, a gentle smile tugging at her lips as she took in his flushed, eager face. Alex was always so full of life, her little ball of energy. But this was different. He looked almost electrified, as if he could barely contain whatever story was bubbling up inside him. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked, kneeling down to his level, her voice warm with affection. Alex's words tumbled out in a rush, his small hands waving in animated gestures. "I met a boy named James, and he looks just like me. Mom, we have the same eyes, the same hair, everything. It's like we're twins." A laugh escaped Sarah's lips as she shook her head gently. "Oh, Alex," she said with a soft chuckle. "I'm sure you two just look a little alike. Sometimes people have similar features, but it doesn't mean they're twins." But Alex wasn't deterred. He grabbed her hand, his fingers clutching hers tightly, eyes pleading with her to understand. "No, Mom, you don't get it," he insisted, his voice trembling with excitement. "He has my eyes, the exact same color and shape. His nose is just like mine too. We're even the same height." Sarah's smile softened, but she kept her tone light, hoping to calm the racing mind of her imaginative son. "Honey, lots of people look a bit alike. It doesn't make them related. I would know if I had twins." "But Mom," he pressed on, a stubborn set to his small jaw. What if we got separated at birth? Like in those movies?" "Life isn't like the movies, honey," she replied, gently smoothing his hair. "Those things don't happen in real life." But she could see her words weren't reaching him. The spark that had lit his face moments before was dimming, replaced by disappointment and a flicker of sadness. He looked down at his shoes, shoulders slumping, his earlier excitement slipping away like sand through fingers. "You don't believe me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a small tremor of hurt lacing his words. Sarah's heart clenched. She hated seeing him like this. She reached out, drawing him close and wrapping her arms around his small shoulders, feeling his head settle against her chest. "It's not that I don't believe you, Alex," she murmured, rubbing his back. "I believe you think you two look very alike. It's just that sometimes our imaginations can play tricks on us, especially when we're excited." He pulled away slightly, looking up at her with a hint of defiance in his eyes. "But it's not my imagination, Mom. You'll see when you meet him." Sarah held his gaze, feeling a tug in her chest. She didn't want to dismiss his feelings, but she couldn't help but think he was caught up in a wild idea, just as he had been so many times before. And yet, something in his expression, the unwavering belief in his eyes, left her with a small seed of doubt. She quickly pushed the thought aside. Alex had always had a vivid imagination. This was just one of those times. "I'm sure I'll meet him soon," she said, forcing a smile, "and I'm looking forward to it." Satisfied, though not completely convinced, Alex nodded. He turned to go to his room, but his earlier excitement was gone, replaced by the quiet drag of his feet on the carpet as he made his way down the hall. Sarah watched him go, a small frown creasing her forehead. She hated seeing the light dimmed in his eyes, but she also knew it was important to keep his feet on the ground. Still, as she picked up the next shirt to fold, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something to his story. The intensity of his belief tugged at her thoughts, creeping into her mind like an insistent whisper. But there were still 1,000 things to do around the house. And she quickly dismissed the thought, telling herself it was just another childhood fancy. Later that evening, as the aroma of roasted chicken filled the kitchen, Sarah set the last dish on the table just as her husband, Greg, walked in. His tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up, a tired smile softening his features. Sarah passed him the bowl of mashed potatoes as he settled in beside Alex. "How was work today?" she asked, giving him a warm smile as he took the bowl from her hands. "Oh, same old paperwork," he said, stifling a yawn. "Nothing exciting." He turned to Alex, ruffling his hair. "How about you, champ? Anything fun happen at school?" Alex's eyes lit up instantly, and he glanced between his mom and dad, a glimmer of hope reigniting in his expression. "Dad, you won't believe it, I met my twin today." Greg froze, his fork hovering mid-air as he looked at Alex, a strange expression flitting across his face. "Your twin?" Sarah chuckled, shaking her head with a dismissive smile. "Alex's imagination has been running wild. He met a boy who looks a bit like him and now thinks they're twins." But Alex wasn't laughing. He looked up at Greg with an earnest expression. "His name is James. Dad, he looks exactly like me. Even our voices sound alike." Greg's hand trembled slightly as he set his fork down, his face growing pale. His gaze flickered to Sarah, a shadow of unease clouding his eyes. The easy smile had vanished, replaced by something else, something almost like fear. "Is that so?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it's true," Alex continued, oblivious to the tension that had descended over the table. "Mom doesn't believe me, but when you see him, you'll know." Greg forced a tight smile, picking up his fork again, though his grip on it was almost painfully tense. "I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Alex, lots of people look alike. That doesn't mean they're related." Alex's face fell, his shoulders slumping as disappointment settled over him like a heavy weight. "You don't believe me either," he mumbled, pushing his food around his plate. Sarah reached out, placing a gentle hand on Alex's. "We believe you met someone who looks like you, sweetheart, but the idea of a secret twin," she glanced at Greg, whose face had grown even more strained. "Well, that's a little far-fetched." But as she watched her husband avoid her gaze, focusing intently on his plate, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had expected him to laugh, maybe joke about Alex's wild imagination. Instead, his hands shook as he cut his chicken, and his face was drawn tight, as if he were holding something back. She looked at him closely, feeling a strange chill creep up her spine. What was he hiding? The next morning, Sarah could still feel the uneasy weight lingering from dinner the night before. She had lain awake for hours, the image of Greg's pale face and trembling hands replaying in her mind. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was hiding something. And last night had left her with a sense of something buried just beneath the surface, a secret that neither Alex nor she had the faintest idea about. "Mom, we have class photos today." Alex's voice snapped her from her thoughts. He was grinning, already dressed in his favorite sweater, his hair carefully combed, a hopeful sparkle lighting up his eyes. Sarah smiled, pulling herself back to the present. "You look so handsome," she said, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. But her smile faltered when she noticed his anxious expression as he tugged at her sleeve. "Can I ask Miss Carter if I can stand next to James for the photo?" Alex asked, barely able to contain his excitement. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her heart softening. "Why do you want to stand with him so badly, sweetheart?" "Because then you and Dad will have to believe me," he replied earnestly, his young voice laced with conviction. "You'll see how much we look alike. Then you'll know I'm not making it up." Sarah's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to protect him from disappointment but couldn't bring herself to brush off his enthusiasm again. "All right," she said gently, "if Miss Carter agrees, I don't see why not." As Alex bounded away toward the school bus, Sarah found herself watching him a little longer than usual, her mind swirling with questions she had tried to ignore. The way he and James seemed drawn to each other, the certainty in his eyes when he described their resemblance, it all lingered like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. That afternoon, Sarah returned to school to pick up Alex. Eager to see his face and hear about his day. The moment he spotted her, he dashed toward her, clutching a crumpled envelope in his hand. His cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom," he called, thrusting the envelope into her hand. "Look, the class photos. And guess what? Miss Carter let me stand next to James. Now you have to believe me." The hint of defiance in his voice was both endearing and unsettling. Taking a deep breath, Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out the glossy photo, her fingers trembling slightly as she searched for Alex among the row of smiling faces. There, in the middle of the second row, stood her son, shoulder to shoulder with a boy who looked just like him. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she took in the details. The same dark brown hair, tousled and a bit messy. The same wide green eyes. The identical dimpled smiles. She scanned the photo repeatedly, half convinced she was imagining it. But there was no denying it, the boys looked identical. For a moment, her vision blurred as a wave of disbelief washed over her. She thought of all the stories she'd read about long-lost siblings and secret twins. Tales that belonged in novels or movies, not in real life. And yet, here she was, holding undeniable proof of a resemblance that defied explanation. "Mom," Alex whispered, tugging at her sleeve and pulling her from her thoughts. His face was a mixture of pride and relief, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. "Now do you believe me?" Sarah knelt down, her voice soft, almost trembling. "Alex, honey, this is incredible." She struggled to find the words, glancing between the photo and her son's eager eyes. "I can see why you're so convinced." Alex beamed, and for a moment, his excitement was infectious. But as she stood up, tucking the photo carefully back into the envelope, a familiar feeling of unease settled over her. She thought of Greg, his nervous expression, the way he had shut down the conversation at dinner. The thought lingered like a weight in her chest. As they made their way home, Alex chattered on about school, his words flowing around her like a distant hum. Sarah's mind, however, was somewhere else entirely, racing with possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. She could still feel the weight of the class photo in her bag. A reminder of something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. When Greg came home that evening, Sarah could barely contain her thoughts. She was torn between confronting him with the photo and keeping it to herself, hoping for some reasonable explanation. But as they sat down to dinner, with Alex beside them, she felt the tension between them building like a storm waiting to break. "So, Alex," Greg began, glancing nervously at Sarah before focusing on his son. "Anything interesting happen at school today?" Alex's face lit up as he looked from his father to his mother, a proud grin spreading across his face. "I showed Mom the class photo," he said, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "Now she has to believe me." Sarah felt Greg's gaze shift to her. His expression guarded. She could sense his discomfort, the way his hands stilled over his plate, as though he knew what was coming. Without a word, Sarah pulled the photo from her bag and laid it on the table. "Look at this, Greg," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Greg's face drained of color as his eyes fell on the picture. For a long moment, he simply stared, his gaze moving from Alex's face to the boy beside him, his hands clenching and unclenching as he studied the image. Then he looked up, his face tight with a mixture of fear and something else Sarah couldn't quite place. "Greg," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there something you're not telling me?" He looked away, swallowing hard, his jaw set as though holding back words he wasn't ready to say. "Sarah, it's just a coincidence," he murmured, his voice strained. "There's no way they could be related." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She saw the way he avoided her gaze, the way his hands shook slightly as he reached for his glass of water. She knew him well enough to see when he was lying. "Greg," she said, her voice firmer this time, her gaze unwavering. "You're not telling me the truth, are you?" Greg set down his glass, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his own words was too much to bear. For a moment, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and something darker, something that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Sarah, I promise you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "there's nothing to worry about." But as he spoke, Sarah could see the lie beneath his words. The way his eyes shifted away. As though hiding from the truth even he wasn't ready to face. She could feel the walls closing in around her. Each unspoken word thickening the air between them. Filling her with a sense of dread that gnawed at her heart. And as she looked back at the photo, the faces of Alex and James staring up at her, she knew one thing with chilling certainty: whatever secrets Greg was hiding, they were only just beginning to surface. The morning light cast a warm glow across Sarah's kitchen as she stood at the counter, nervously tapping her fingers against her coffee cup. The house was quiet, with Alex already off to school. But Sarah's thoughts were anything but calm. She replayed the conversation from the previous night with Greg over and over in her mind. Each silence, each evasion, deepening her suspicions. Something was wrong, something Greg wasn't telling her. As she mulled over the previous day's events, her gaze fell on the class photo still lying on the counter. The one of Alex standing shoulder to shoulder with James. She picked it up, staring at the two boys and feeling a strange pull in her chest. The resemblance was more than striking, it was haunting. How was it possible? Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. She picked it up to see a message from the school, a reminder about the upcoming parent-teacher meeting next week. Instinctively, Sarah's mind drifted to James's mother, the woman who would undoubtedly be attending that meeting too. What was her name? Claire? Carla? She quickly scrolled through her contacts, searching for any trace of James's mother's number, and came up empty. Miss Carter, she murmured to herself, thinking of Alex's teacher. She might know how I can get in touch. Without a second thought, Sarah dialed the school's main office, her fingers trembling as she punched in the numbers. After a few rings, a cheerful receptionist answered. Maple Grove Elementary. How may I assist you? Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Hi, this is Sarah Evans, Alex's mom. I was wondering if you could put me through to Miss Carter. His teacher? I'd like to ask her about one of Alex's classmates. One moment, please, the receptionist said. Sarah tapped her fingers on the countertop, her heart racing as she waited. Finally, a warm, familiar voice filled the line. Hello, Miss Evans? This is Miss Carter. How can I help? Hi, Miss Carter, Sarah replied, her voice wavering slightly. I'm sorry to bother you, but I had a question. Alex has a new friend named James in his class. I wanted to see if you could provide me with his mother's contact information. I think it's important. There was a brief pause. Then Miss Carter replied, Of course, I'll have to double check that it's okay to share. But I'll reach out to her mother and let her know you'd like to speak. Thank you so much, Sarah said, relieved. I really appreciate it. As she hung up, a mix of relief and anxiety washed over her. She had taken the first step. Now, all she had to do was wait. That afternoon, as she was preparing lunch, her phone rang again. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her heart skip a beat. Claire Parker, it read. Sarah swallowed hard, steeling herself before she answered. Hello, this is Sarah Evans, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Hi, Sarah, came a warm voice on the other end. This is Claire Parker, James's mother. I hear you wanted to talk? Sarah felt her throat tighten. Yes. Thank you for calling me back. I know this might sound strange, but I think we need to meet. There was a pause, and Sarah held her breath, wondering if Claire would think she was completely out of her mind. But Claire's response was soft, almost as if she understood the weight of the situation without needing further explanation. You know, she said quietly, I was thinking the same thing. There's a coffee shop downtown, the Cozy Cup. Maybe we could meet there tomorrow afternoon? Sarah felt a rush of gratitude. That sounds perfect. Thank you, Claire. I'll see you tomorrow. As she hung up, Sarah took a deep, shaky breath, the reality of her decision settling in. Tomorrow, she would finally begin to uncover the truth. The drive home from the Cozy Cup felt like a blur. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with everything Claire had shared. Every unanswered question and every possibility that now felt all too real. She barely noticed the streets slipping by as she went over the conversation again and again. Her heart pounding, Could Alex and James really be brothers? The idea both terrified and thrilled her. But it also brought a single question to the forefront of her mind. What did Greg know? When she arrived home, she found Greg in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his phone in his hand. He looked up as she walked in, his eyes widening slightly as if he could sense something had changed. Hey, honey, he said, putting on a smile that looked strained. Where've you been? Sarah hesitated, her pulse racing. She could tell him the truth that she'd met Claire and that together they were piecing together a puzzle that could change everything. But a chill ran down her spine as she recalled Greg's pale face and evasive answers from the night before. Oh, just running errands, she replied, forcing a casual tone. Had a few things to pick up. Greg nodded, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, as if he were trying to read her mind. A silence settled between them, heavy and thick, and Sarah could feel the tension building with each second. Finally, she forced herself to move, breaking the moment as she headed upstairs, her thoughts a storm of suspicion and doubt. The next morning, Sarah was up early, her resolve hardening as she prepared for the day. She had decided to visit the adoption center, hoping to get answers without Greg's interference. She dropped Alex off at school, feeling his absence beside her as she drove toward the center. With every mile that passed, her anxiety grew, but so did her determination. She had to know the truth. As she pulled into the parking lot, a strange sensation washed over her, like déjà vu mixed with a sense of foreboding. The building looked innocent enough. A small, brick-walled structure with welcoming windows and potted plants lining the entrance. But as Sarah turned off the car and prepared to go inside, her heart skipped a beat. There, at the far end of the lot, she saw a familiar car, the black sedan Greg drove every day. No, she whispered, disbelief and a surge of anger bubbling up inside her. She watched as Greg climbed out of the car, glancing around as if to ensure no one had followed him. Sarah shrank down, gripping the steering wheel, feeling a blend of fury and betrayal swell within her. What was he doing here? Why had he lied to her? With her heart pounding, Sarah watched as he entered the building. She waited a few minutes, her mind racing, before she, too, stepped out of the car. She couldn't believe she was doing this, but her instincts told her she had to find out what Greg was up to. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number, holding her breath as the phone rang. Hey, honey, Greg answered on the third ring. His voice sounded tense, as if he were distracted. What's up? Sarah kept her voice as neutral as possible. Where are you? She asked, glancing up at the building's windows, half expecting to see him peering out. I'm at the office, Greg replied, his tone almost too casual. Got a busy day ahead. Sarah's jaw clenched as her fingers tightened around the phone. She could feel the weight of his lie pressing down on her, each word filling her with anger she struggled to contain. Okay, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll see you later. Then, she hung up before he could respond, staring at her phone in disbelief. He was lying to her, plain and simple, and she had just witnessed it firsthand. With her stomach twisting, Sarah took a deep breath and entered the adoption center. She was greeted by a receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, who looked up as she approached. Good morning, the receptionist said. How can I help you? Sarah cleared her throat, trying to keep her composure. Hi, I'm here to inquire about some records. My name is Sarah Evans, and I'm trying to find information about a boy who was adopted here about 10 years ago. His name is James Parker. The receptionist's smile faded slightly, and she shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry, but we can't share any information about adoptions without proper authorization. Sarah felt a surge of frustration rise within her. I understand, but I'm not asking for anything confidential, she said, her voice soft but firm. I just need to know if there's a record of his adoption. The receptionist hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the back of the office. I'm really sorry, she said quietly. We're not allowed to disclose any information without going through the proper legal channels. Sarah took a step closer, lowering her voice. Please, I think he might be my son's twin. I just need a yes or no. But the receptionist only shook her head, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, Mrs. Evans, I can't help you. Frustrated, Sarah looked around, noticing that some of the other staff seemed to be avoiding her gaze. It was as if they knew something and were purposefully keeping it hidden. Her gaze fell on the receptionist once more, a new thought striking her. Has someone instructed you to say that? To keep this quiet? The receptionist looked down, her face reddening slightly. I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't say anything more. Realizing she wasn't going to get any further, Sarah left the office, her emotions a whirlwind of frustration and desperation. As she reached her car, she looked around, scanning the parking lot until her eyes fell on Greg's sedan again. He was still inside, his head bowed, as though deep in thought or hiding something. Sarah felt her hands shake as she fumbled for her phone and dialed Claire's number. The events at the adoption center had left her shaken, and she needed to talk to someone who would understand. Hello? Claire answered, her voice warm and concerned. Claire, Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice steady. I need to tell you what just happened. I went to the adoption center. And Greg was there. He lied to me about being at work. And they wouldn't give me any information. It's as if they're hiding something. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And when Claire finally spoke, her voice was laced with worry. Sarah, that sounds suspicious. It seems like they're trying to cover something up. Sarah nodded, even though Claire couldn't see her. I think you're right. I don't know what to think anymore. Greg's lying to me, and the adoption center staff acted so strange. Claire's voice softened. Listen, if they won't give us information, there's another way to find out the truth. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? A DNA test. Claire said, her tone resolute. If Alex and James are twins, that would confirm it without needing anyone else's permission. Sarah's heart leapt at the suggestion. Of course. Why hadn't she thought of that? It was the one way to get answers without relying on anyone else. Without having to go through the adoption center or rely on Greg. That's brilliant, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with relief. Why didn't I think of that? Claire, thank you. This could finally give us answers. They quickly made a plan, agreeing to take Alex and James to a clinic the next morning for the test. It'll be our secret for now, Claire said gently, just until we know the truth. Sarah agreed, even though she felt a pang of guilt. Keeping this from Greg didn't feel right, but given his recent behavior, she knew it was necessary. The next morning, Sarah was up early, waking Alex and telling him they had a special checkup to go to. His eyes lit up with curiosity, but he didn't ask any questions, simply nodding as he got dressed. As they drove to the clinic, Sarah's heart pounded with every mile, her mind racing with possibilities. She glanced at Alex in the rearview mirror, her thoughts a mixture of hope and fear. If the test confirmed what she suspected, their lives would never be the same. When they arrived, Claire and James were already waiting outside. The boys ran to each other immediately, their identical smiles lighting up their faces. And Sarah felt her heart ache at the sight. Inside, a kind nurse explained the procedure to the boys, taking swabs from the inside of their cheeks and reassuring them that it wouldn't hurt. Alex and James held hands, their faces serious, as if they sensed the gravity of the moment even if they didn't fully understand it. All done, the nurse said cheerfully, handing Sarah and Claire some paperwork to complete. The results should be ready in a few days. As they left the clinic, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. The test was done, and now all they could do was wait. And as she looked at Alex's smiling face, she couldn't help but wonder what truths lay ahead, waiting to be uncovered. The days that followed were an agonizing blur for Sarah. She moved through them in a daze, going through the motions of daily life but constantly on edge, her mind anchored to the DNA test results that could change everything. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart would race, only for her spirits to drop when it wasn't the call she was waiting for. At home, she avoided Greg's eyes. Every shared dinner felt stifling, as though the air between them was thick with the weight of the secrets they both carried. She was torn between confronting him with her suspicions and waiting for the test results. Greg had tried to break the silence a few times, giving her puzzled looks, but he seemed to sense her unease, keeping his distance as well. Then, on the third day, the call finally came. Sarah was folding laundry when her phone vibrated on the counter. She froze, her hands suddenly trembling as she reached for it. She saw Claire's name flashing on the screen, and her heart leapt to her throat. "Claire?" she answered, her voice barely a whisper. Claire's tone was tense, laced with a barely contained excitement. "The clinic just called. The results are ready." A wave of emotions crashed over Sarah: relief, fear, anticipation, and an ache she couldn't name. Did they tell you over the phone?" "No," Claire replied. "They said we need to come in person to get them. I thought maybe we could open them together?" "Yes," Sarah said quickly, her voice thick with gratitude. "I'll be there as soon as I can. Let's meet at your place." She hung up, her fingers trembling as she slipped the phone into her bag and hurried out the door. The drive to Claire's house felt endless, her mind racing through every possible outcome, each one as terrifying as it was exhilarating. What if Alex and James were twins? What if everything she thought she knew about her son's birth was a lie? By the time she pulled into Claire's driveway, her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Claire met her at the door, her face pale but her eyes steady, filled with the same determination that kept Sarah going. "Come in," Claire murmured, stepping aside. Together, they walked into the living room, where a small, unassuming envelope lay on the coffee table, its plain appearance belying the weight of the truth it held. They sat down across from each other, the silence stretching as they both stared at the envelope. Sarah's hands were clammy, her nerves a tangled mess of anticipation and dread. "Are you ready?" Claire whispered, glancing at her with a shaky smile. Sarah nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Let's do this." Claire reached out, her fingers trembling as she carefully picked up the envelope and tore it open. She pulled out the sheet of paper, unfolding it slowly, as though prolonging the final seconds before their lives changed forever. They both leaned in, their eyes scanning the words printed in black and white. And then they saw it, the words that confirmed everything. 99.9% probability of identical twins. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. She felt a wave of disbelief and relief wash over her, a rush of emotions that left her breathless. They're really twins," she whispered, her voice breaking. Claire let out a choked sob, her own eyes brimming with tears. "I can't believe it," she murmured, shaking her head in amazement. "All this time, James had a brother, and we never knew." The reality of it settled over them like a heavy blanket, each woman grappling with the knowledge that their sons were brothers, separated by a twist of fate they still couldn't fully understand. But as the initial shock wore off, Sarah's relief turned to something darker, a simmering anger, an ache of betrayal. She thought of Greg, his evasions, his insistence that Alex and James's resemblance was just a coincidence. And now, the truth was staring her in the face, undeniable and impossible to ignore. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of confusion and fury. "How could this happen? How could I not know my son had a twin brother?" Claire reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, I think it sounds like Greg might know something. His reaction when Alex first mentioned James, didn't he seem strange?" Sarah nodded, feeling a knot of anger tighten in her chest. "Yes. He's been acting so secretive, dodging my questions. And then I saw him at the adoption center, lying to me about being at work." She clenched her fists, her voice laced with pain. "I think he's known all along." Claire's gaze softened, filled with compassion. "Then you need to talk to him. Sarah, whatever the truth is, he owes it to you and to Alex to come clean." Sarah nodded, steeling herself. The thought of confronting Greg terrified her, but she knew it was the only way forward. "You're right," she whispered, her voice steadying. "I need answers. For Alex. For both of our boys." That evening, Sarah waited until after Alex had gone to bed. She sat alone in the living room, the DNA results lying in her lap, her gaze fixed on the photo of Alex and James she had brought from the kitchen. Her mind raced with every possible scenario, every lie Greg could have told to keep her in the dark. The sound of Greg's car pulling into the driveway snapped her out of her thoughts. She braced herself, clutching the paper tightly as she heard the front door open. Greg walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that faded as soon as he saw her expression. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice wary as he set down his briefcase. "Is everything okay?" Without a word, Sarah held up the DNA results. Her gaze unwavering. "Greg," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "I want the truth about Alex." Greg's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as he stared at the paper in her hands. For a moment, he looked as though he might try to deny it, but then his shoulders slumped, and he sank into a chair across from her, his face etched with a mix of shame and regret. I don't know where to start," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Start with the truth," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "Please, Greg, just tell me the truth." He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Sarah, do you remember how difficult your pregnancy was? How the doctors were worried about complications?" She nodded, a chill running down her spine. "Yes. It was touch and go. But I thought everything was fine once I came to and saw you holding Alex." Greg swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "Sarah, our biological child didn't make it. The doctors did everything they could. But, it was too late." The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath her, leaving her reeling, barely able to process what he was saying. "But then, how?" she stammered, tears streaming down her face. "Greg, I don't understand. How did we end up with Alex?" Greg closed his eyes, his face filled with a tortured guilt. After the loss. I was devastated. But then I found out about a pair of twin boys who had just been born and were placed for adoption. I arranged for us to adopt one of them. I thought it would give us a second chance." Sarah stared at him in shock, her heart breaking as she struggled to process his words. You lied to me. You kept this secret from me for all these years. Let me believe that Alex was our biological son. I thought I was protecting you," Greg said, his voice filled with desperation. "I was terrified of what the truth would do to you. To us. I thought, if I could just make it go away, we could move on." Sarah shook her head, her hands shaking as she gripped the paper in her lap. "You had no right to make that decision for me. No right to keep this from me. From Alex. He deserves to know who he is. Where he comes from." Greg reached for her hand, but she pulled away, the pain and betrayal in her heart too deep to ignore. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you. I wanted to protect our family." But Sarah couldn't look at him. The truth was out, but it felt like a hollow victory. A truth marred by lies and secrets that had poisoned everything she thought she knew about her family. She stood, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need some time, Greg," she said, her heart breaking. "I need to think." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her mind swirling with the weight of all that had been revealed. The next afternoon, Sarah arrived at the Cozy Cup 15 minutes early. Her nerves on edge, she scanned the room, choosing a quiet corner table with a view of the door, and ordered a latte. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching painfully as she waited, her hands fidgeting with the photo of Alex she had brought along. Finally, the door swung open, and a woman entered, glancing around uncertainly. She had a kind face, with soft brown curls framing her cheeks. And when her gaze settled on Sarah, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Sarah?" she asked, approaching the table with a tentative smile. Sarah stood, offering a nervous smile of her own. "Claire, it's nice to meet you." They shook hands and sat, the silence between them both awkward and charged with unspoken questions. A waiter brought Claire a cappuccino, and for a few moments, they each sipped their drinks in silence. Finally, Claire set her cup down, her hands shaking slightly as she reached into her bag. "James showed me his class photo last night," she said, her voice soft. "And when I saw the boy standing next to him," she pulled out the photo, setting it on the table. "I couldn't believe it. They look exactly alike." Sarah let out a shaky breath, nodding. "That's my son, Alex," she murmured, her gaze flicking between the photo and Claire's anxious face. "When he came home talking about a twin, I thought it was just his imagination. But when I saw the photo," she trailed off, the words catching in her throat. Claire swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, there's something you need to know. James, he's adopted. The words hit Sarah like a jolt. She stared at Claire, her mind reeling. Adopted, she echoed, barely able to process it. Claire nodded, her face pale. I adopted him when he was just a baby. I don't know much about his birth family. The adoption agency didn't have much information, only that he had been placed in their care shortly after birth. Sarah sank back in her chair, her mind spinning as she struggled to make sense of what Claire was telling her. She thought back to Alex's birth. How the delivery had been difficult. How she'd fainted partway through, and woken up only to find her husband Greg holding their son, telling her that everything was fine, that they had a beautiful, healthy boy. A pang of doubt stirred within her. For the first time, she began to wonder if maybe, somehow, there was more to Alex's birth than she'd been told. Claire, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. When Alex was born, it was a difficult delivery. I don't remember much. Greg, my husband, told me everything went fine. But now, she paused, feeling a wave of nausea rise in her. Now I don't know what to believe. The two women sat in silence, each lost in thought, the magnitude of their discovery weighing heavily on them. Finally, Claire reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's. I think, Claire said slowly, her voice filled with determination. We need to keep investigating this. If there's any chance that Alex and James are related, we need to know. Sarah nodded, the fear in her heart mingling with a strange, fragile hope. You're right. We need answers. And I think I need to talk to Greg about this. As she said the words, Sarah felt a surge of resolve, a determination to confront whatever secrets were hiding in the shadows of her family's past. Whatever the truth was, she would find it, and she would face it head on. The following days felt like an emotional storm Sarah couldn't escape. The weight of Greg's betrayal hung heavy over her, each detail sinking deeper, reshaping the way she saw her husband and their entire life together. The reality of Alex's origins, of the twin he'd been separated from, was a revelation that left her raw, angry, and lost. She found herself watching Alex with a painful tenderness, marveling at how much he meant to her, yet realizing she had been kept from knowing the truth of his story. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah sat alone on the back porch, gazing at the fading light. She hadn't spoken much to Greg since the confrontation. He had tried to reach out to her, but she needed time. Her thoughts drifted to Alex and James, two boys brought together by a twist of fate and kept apart by choices made without their knowledge. The thought filled her with a resolve she hadn't felt in days. She would make things right, no matter what it took. Just then, the back door creaked open, and she turned to see Greg stepping outside, his face shadowed with remorse. He approached cautiously, as if afraid to intrude on her solitude. Sarah, he began, his voice quiet. I know I've hurt you. I've been thinking about everything. And I'm so sorry. I can't begin to explain how much I regret the choices I made. She said nothing, keeping her gaze fixed on the last slivers of light disappearing beyond the trees. But Greg continued, stepping closer. When Alex was born, he murmured, his voice breaking, you were so fragile, Sarah. I was terrified of how losing our child would affect you. So when I found out about the twins, I thought adopting Alex would give us a second chance. I truly believed I was doing the right thing. You decided that for me, Sarah said softly, finally turning to meet his gaze. Her eyes burned with a mixture of anger and pain. You kept me in the dark. And you let me believe that Alex was ours. Do you have any idea how much that hurts? Greg's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. I was wrong, Sarah. I know that now. I didn't realize how much keeping this secret would cost Alex. Sarah clenched her fists, struggling to keep her composure. It's more than just a cost, Greg. It's his entire identity. You've robbed him of knowing his brother, of knowing where he really came from. And you robbed me of the chance to make my own decision. To mourn, to process the loss of our child. Tears welled in Greg's eyes as he listened, his expression filled with regret. I thought I was protecting you. But I see now that I was wrong. I've broken your trust. Sarah, and I don't know if I can ever make that right. But if there's any way to fix this, to move forward, please tell me. I'll do anything. The sincerity in his voice struck a chord in her, and Sarah felt her resolve waver. She wanted to scream, to make him understand the depth of the pain he'd caused. But she also knew he was right about one thing. They couldn't turn back time. They had to move forward. Somehow. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself and met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. If we're going to have any chance of rebuilding our family, then we need to start with honesty. Total honesty. Greg. No more secrets. No more lies. And that means telling Alex the truth about everything. Greg swallowed, his face paling slightly. You mean, about his adoption? About James? Yes, Sarah said firmly. He deserves to know the truth. And he deserves the chance to know his brother. We can't hide this from him any longer. It's not fair. Greg looked away, nodding slowly, as if absorbing the weight of her words. I understand. You're right, he murmured. He needs to know. I don't know how to begin to tell him. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy, her anger softening just a bit as she looked at her husband. We'll tell him together, she said quietly, taking his hand in hers. It won't be easy, but we owe him that much. Greg looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Sarah, he whispered. I know I don't deserve it. But, thank you. They sat together in silence, their hands entwined, sharing a tentative truce as the night closed in around them. They both knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with difficult conversations and painful revelations. But for the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Blank. Blank. The next day, Sarah and Greg took a deep breath as they called Alex into the living room. He bounded in, cheerful as ever, a wide grin on his face as he plopped down on the couch, unaware of the gravity of the conversation about to unfold. Alex, Sarah began, her voice soft but steady. We need to talk to you about something very important. Alex's smile faded slightly as he looked between his parents, sensing the serious tone. Is something wrong? No, sweetheart, Greg said, his voice calm but trembling. There's just something we need to tell you. Something we should have told you a long time ago. Alex's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. What is it? Sarah took a deep breath, glancing at Greg before turning back to Alex. Honey, we need you to know that you're adopted. The room fell silent, the weight of the words settling heavily over them. Alex stared at his parents, his face a mixture of confusion and shock. Adopted, he whispered, as if testing the word on his tongue. Yes, Greg said gently. When you were born, there were complications. Our baby didn't survive, but we adopted you shortly after that. You became part of our family, and we've loved you from the moment we held you. Alex looked down, processing this information. So, you're not my real parents? Sarah reached out, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Oh, sweetheart, we are your real parents. We may not be related by blood, but that doesn't change how much we love you. Nothing can change that. Alex's gaze softened as he looked at his mother, her words seeming to soothe his confusion. Then, why didn't you tell me? Sarah exchanged a pained glance with Greg before answering. We should have, Alex. And we're sorry. We thought we were protecting you. But keeping this from you was wrong. Alex nodded slowly, his young mind working through the weight of their words. Is that why James and I look the same? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Greg's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. Yes, James. He's your twin brother. A stunned silence followed, and Alex's face went pale, his eyes wide with shock. My twin? You mean, we're actually brothers? Yes, Sarah said, her voice breaking as she reached for his hand. James is your twin. You were separated when you were born. And we only just found out the truth ourselves. For a moment, Alex was silent, his gaze distant as he absorbed everything they'd told him. Then, to their surprise, a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. I knew it, he whispered, a spark of excitement breaking through his shock. I knew we looked alike for a reason. A tearful smile crossed Sarah's face as she reached out to hug him, her heart swelling with pride at his resilience. Greg joined them, his hand resting on Alex's shoulder. His eyes filled with remorse and love. "We're so sorry for keeping this from you, Alex," Greg whispered, "and we'll do whatever it takes to make this right. You and James, you deserve to know each other. To be brothers." Alex nodded, his small hand reaching up to wipe a tear from his cheek. "I want to know him," he said softly. "I want to know my brother." The family sat together, bound by the difficult truth they'd shared but united in a new purpose. For the first time, the walls between them felt thinner, the darkness of the past lifting as they moved toward a new chapter, one where honesty and love could finally prevail. The day had finally arrived. Sarah and Claire had arranged a gathering at Claire's house. A quiet Sunday afternoon where Alex and James would meet not just as friends but as brothers. After everything that had come to light, Sarah's nerves were frayed, but she was determined to make this day a joyful one, a day of healing and hope. She wanted Alex to feel the warmth and excitement of family, a bond built on truth this time. As they pulled up to Claire's home, Sarah glanced back at Alex in the rearview mirror. He was quiet, his gaze focused on the window, but she could see the anticipation bubbling beneath his stillness. His fingers fidgeted, picking at a loose thread on his jeans, his eyes wide with barely contained excitement. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" she asked, reaching back to give his hand a gentle squeeze. Alex turned to her, a hesitant smile breaking through his nervous expression. "Yeah, I'm ready," he said softly, his voice tinged with a hint of wonder. "I've never had a brother before. I hope he likes me." Sarah's heart ached at the vulnerability in his words, and she reached over to cup his cheek. "Oh, Alex, he's going to love you. You're two parts of the same story. You were always meant to know each other." Alex nodded, his eyes brightening as he looked back toward the house. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, then stepped out of the car with Alex beside her, his hand clinging tightly to hers. She knew that once he crossed the threshold into Claire's home, a piece of his life he'd never known was waiting for him. The front door opened, and there stood Claire with James by her side. The moment the two boys' eyes met, a shared recognition passed between them. Something deep and unspoken. They stared at each other for a moment, taking in the similarities: the same tousled hair, the identical spark in their wide, curious eyes. It was as if they were seeing a reflection in a mirror, one that had been hidden from them for far too long. James took a step forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and excitement. "Hi, Alex," he said, his voice a little shaky but filled with warmth. "It's really nice to meet you." Alex's face lit up, a huge grin spreading across his face as he stepped closer. "Yeah, it's nice to meet you too. I mean, I always kind of thought you were like me, but now I know you actually are." The boys shared a laugh, their voices mingling in a way that sounded so familiar, as if they'd always known each other. Sarah and Claire exchanged a glance, both mothers teary-eyed as they watched their sons connect in a way that words couldn't capture. It was a bond born of something deeper than mere friendship, a bond that had been waiting to be realized. Claire invited everyone inside, leading them to the living room, where a spread of snacks and drinks was laid out on the coffee table. The boys were too excited to eat. They sat on the floor, cross-legged and leaning in close as they exchanged stories, each detail seeming to bring them closer together. They shared tales of school, favorite hobbies, and even their embarrassing moments, both of them laughing at how similar their experiences had been. Sarah sat beside Claire on the couch, both mothers quietly marveling at the scene before them. Claire leaned over, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's amazing, isn't it? They're like two sides of the same coin." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "It's beautiful, watching them like this. I feel like all the secrets and the pain of the past are melting away. They deserve this. To be brothers." Claire placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "And they will be. We'll make sure of that. No matter what it takes." As the afternoon wore on, Alex and James moved to the backyard, where they began tossing a ball back and forth, their laughter filling the air. They worked together to build a fort out of branches, discussing where each stick should go, each of them trying to outdo the other with ideas. At one point, Alex slipped in the mud, and James burst out laughing before offering him a hand to help him up. Sarah and Claire watched from the patio, sharing smiles and quietly cheering them on. But as the sun dipped lower, Sarah knew the conversation couldn't remain just between the boys forever. She glanced at Claire, giving her a nod. It was time to talk as families. Boys, Claire called out gently, come over here, there's something we want to talk to you about. Alex and James exchanged a quick, curious glance, then walked over, their hands brushing as they made their way to their mothers. They settled on the patio steps, still smiling, but Sarah could see a glimmer of nerves in Alex's expression. Claire took a deep breath, her hand resting on James's shoulder. We wanted to talk to you both about something important. Now that you know your brothers, there's so much we want to share with you. We want you to know that this connection between you, it's special. Alex looked from Claire to Sarah, his brow furrowing slightly. Does this mean we can spend more time together? He asked, hope shining in his eyes. Sarah smiled, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Alex's forehead. Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what it means. We're a family now, all of us, and you two deserve to be part of each other's lives. James looked down, his voice quiet. I always felt like something was missing, he murmured, glancing at Alex. Now, I don't feel that way anymore. The boys shared a smile, one that spoke of a connection beyond words. A connection that had been waiting to surface for years. Claire leaned in, her voice filled with gentle warmth. We'll make this work, however we need to. We'll have dinners, sleepovers, whatever you two want. We'll be there. Alex's face lit up, his eyes brimming with gratitude as he looked at his mother. Then at Claire. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I always wanted a brother. I just didn't know he was so close all along. James nudged Alex playfully, his smile wide. Well, now you're stuck with me, he joked, earning a laugh from Alex. As the sun set and the sky turned a soft shade of orange and pink, Sarah felt a weight lift from her heart. This was a new beginning, a family built on honesty, on the bond that Alex and James shared, and on the commitment of two mothers determined to make things right. When it was finally time to go, Alex hugged James tightly, as though he never wanted to let go. I'll see you soon, right? He asked, his voice filled with hope. James nodded, his own eyes shining. Definitely, I can't wait. As Sarah and Alex drove home, she glanced over to see him clutching the small photo of himself and James she had printed from the class photo. A tangible reminder of the bond they'd rediscovered. She reached over, placing her hand over his as he held the photo. I'm so proud of you, Alex, she said softly, her heart swelling with love. Today, you gained a brother, and I couldn't be happier for you. Alex looked at her, his eyes full of joy and understanding. I'm happy too, Mom. I think I finally know who I am. The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had worried about how Alex would handle the truth. But seeing him now, content and secure, she realized that everything they had done, the hard conversations, the painful revelations, had been worth it. As they pulled into the driveway, she took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of promise. And as long as Alex and James had each other, she knew they'd have a future filled with love, laughter, and the unbreakable bond of family. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm of joyful reunion, as the newly connected family formed bonds that felt both thrilling and natural. Alex and James spent every spare moment together, their connection deepening with each passing day. As if they were making up for lost time, the boys quickly became inseparable, filling their days with laughter, adventures, and secrets only they could understand. They were brothers now, and nothing could change that. On a crisp Saturday morning, Sarah and Claire had planned a family picnic at the lake, a way to bring everyone together in a carefree setting where the weight of the past could finally feel distant. As the two families arrived, Alex and James ran ahead, their laughter carrying across the cool morning air. They were already tossing a frisbee back and forth, their voices ringing out in gleeful shouts that filled Sarah's heart with a warm, quiet joy. Greg arrived shortly after, carrying a basket and waving to Sarah with a tentative smile. Their relationship was still fragile, but over the past weeks, They had worked hard to rebuild trust, taking small steps toward healing. Sarah knew that forgiving him completely would take time, but she also recognized his genuine efforts to make things right. Watching him now, joining in to help the boys set up their frisbee game, she felt a hopeful peace settle over her. Feels good to see them like this, doesn't it? Claire murmured, standing beside her. Sarah nodded, her eyes misty as she watched the boys. It does. It really does. They look so whole. Claire gave her a gentle smile. And so do you, Sarah. You've brought us together in a way I never imagined. I'll always be grateful. The two women shared a hug, both feeling the quiet strength of friendship and the depth of what they had faced together. They were family now, bound by their sons and the promise of a shared future. As they spread out a blanket and set up the picnic, the boys darted over, their faces flushed with excitement. Alex flopped down beside Sarah, grabbing a sandwich from the basket while James settled in next to Claire. They chatted and joked, all of them basking in the warmth of the moment. The shadows of the past felt far away, replaced by the joy of this new family they had built together. After lunch, as they lay on the blanket beneath the bright, clear sky, Alex suddenly sat up, a thoughtful expression on his face. Can I say something? He asked. Glancing around, everyone looked at him, smiling encouragingly. Go ahead, Alex, Sarah said, reaching out to brush a stray curl from his forehead. Alex hesitated, then glanced over at James before speaking. I want to say thank you. To all of you. His eyes flickered to Greg. Then back to Sarah. I know things were hard for a while. And I know there were some big secrets. But now, I feel like I know who I am. And I have a brother. He said, grinning at James. And it's the best feeling in the world. James reached over to give him a playful nudge. His smile wide. I feel the same way. It's like we were always supposed to be together. The adults exchanged a glance, feeling the depth of the boy's words. There was a simplicity to it, a truth they had been searching for. And now their sons had found it without even trying. Greg, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat and looked at Alex with a mixture of pride and regret. Alex, I want to say something too, he said, his voice soft. I know I made mistakes. And I'm sorry for all the ways I let you and your mom down. But I want you to know that no matter what, you're my son, and I love you with all my heart. Alex's eyes softened as he met his father's gaze. Nodding slowly. I know, Dad, he said, his voice steady, and I love you too. It was a simple exchange. But Sarah felt a weight lift. A peace settle over them. This was what forgiveness looked like, a gradual, gentle rebuilding, moment by moment. As the day wore on, they spent hours by the lake, sharing stories and planning future family gatherings. Sarah and Claire talked about trips they could take together with the boys, imagining summers filled with camping, road trips, and family traditions they could create as they went. The boys were already making plans of their own, concocting elaborate ideas for a treehouse they would build together and how they would become the cool brothers at school. When the sun began to dip, casting a warm glow over the lake, Sarah felt a sense of peace that went beyond words. She had journeyed through heartbreak and betrayal, struggled to trust again, and learned that healing didn't mean erasing the past but embracing a new beginning. And now, as she looked at the family she had created with Claire, Greg, Alex, and James, she felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to her eyes. Ready to go, Mom? Alex's voice pulled her from her thoughts. And she turned to see him standing beside her, his face glowing with happiness. Yes, she replied, giving him a warm smile as she ruffled his hair. Let's go home. As they packed up, Sarah took one last look at the lake, at the beautiful day they had shared, and felt a deep certainty settle over her. This was their story, a story of resilience, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond of family. And no matter what the future held, they would face it together, knowing that love, honesty, and hope could carry them through anything. Hand in hand with Alex, she walked toward the car, her heart full, her spirit light, ready for whatever came next.